The dust of Redemption Creek held its breath that Tuesday. It clung to the sweat on every face turned toward the stagecoach, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush anxiety and cheap whiskey. They were all there to witness a promise made through the mail, the union of Zara Vane, a woman of breeding from Boston, and Jedediah Stone, the heir to the largest cattle empire in the territory. But promises in the West are as fragile as a desert flower. What they witnessed instead was a humiliation so profound it would curdle the milk in a cow's udder, a rejection that left a woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a future as barren as the Alkali Flats. And then, from the shadows, stepped the one man nobody expected, a silent Apache tracker, a man of ghosts and whispers who would make an offer that would set the entire territory ablaze. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, its axles groaning a final complaint against the unforgiving terrain of the Arizona Territory. For Zara Vane, the stillness was more jarring than the relentless motion of the past 2 weeks. She smoothed the front of her deep blue traveling dress, a garment of fine Boston wool, utterly unsuited for the oppressive June heat. Her gloved hands, trembling slightly, clutched the small, worn, leather-bound volume of Shakespeare in her lap, a final tangible link to the world she had left behind forever. Outside, a low murmur rippled through a crowd. Peeking through the dusty window, Zara saw the town of Redemption Creek for the first time. It was less a town and more a wound in the earth, a single dusty street lined with raw timber buildings baking under a merciless sun. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching black smoke, and at the far end, a stark unpainted church with a crooked steeple. It was in front of this church that her future was supposed to begin. The door was pulled open by a lanky driver whose face was a road map of sun and hardship. "Here you are, ma'am. Redemption Creek." Zara took a deep breath, the air thick with the unfamiliar smells of horse-hot dust and manure. This was it, the culmination of a desperate gamble. After her parents' death and the subsequent discovery of their hidden debts, her position as a well-educated but penniless orphan in Boston had become untenable. The advertisement in the Matrimonial Times had been a lifeline. Mr. Jedediah Stone, a 28-year-old rancher, sought a wife of good character and education. His letters, penned in a surprisingly neat hand, spoke of a prosperous future, of building a life together, of a shared longing for companionship. They were letters of quiet hope, and Zara had clung to them like a prayer. She descended the coach steps, her eyes scanning the crowd for the man whose photograph she kept tucked in her valise, a handsome if somewhat serious-looking man, with kind eyes and a strong jaw. The townsfolk stared openly, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. The women in their faded calico dresses assessed her expensive attire. The men hats pushed back on their heads looked her over with a more primal appraisal. Then she saw him. Jedediah Stone stood near the church steps looking exactly like his photograph, only smaller somehow, less substantial. His gaze darted nervously from her to an older barrel-chested man standing beside him. This second man was a Titan dressed in a tailored black coat despite the heat. His face was granite, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and a magnificent silver mustache did little to soften a mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval. He held a proprietary hand on Jedediah's shoulder. Zara's smile, genuine and full of relief, only a moment before faltered. She started forward, her valise in hand. "Mr. Stone, Jedediah?" Jedediah flinched as if struck. The older man's grip on his shoulder tightened. As Zara drew closer, she could see the sheen of sweat on Jedediah's upper lip. His kind eyes were now filled with a desperate, hunted look. "Miss Vane," the older man boomed, his voice like rocks grinding together. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Zara and his son. "I am Silas Stone, this boy's father." "A pleasure, Mr. Stone," Zara said, her voice a little unsteady. "I am pleased to finally meet you." Silas Stone did not return the pleasantry. His cold eyes raked over her from the fine feather in her hat to the tips of her worn but well-made boots. It was not an assessment. It was an inventory, a calculation of worth, and he found her wanting. "You've had a long journey, Miss Vane," Silas said, his tone deceptively mild. "A pointless one, I'm afraid." A chill colder than any Boston winter crept down Zara's spine. I don't understand." "It's simple enough for a woman of your supposed education." Silas sneered. "My son, in a fit of foolish loneliness, made a miscalculation. There will be no wedding. Not today. Not ever." The words struck her with physical force. The murmur of the crowd died into a shocked absolute silence. Every eye was on her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a tide of humiliation so intense it threatened to suffocate her. She looked past the father to the son. "Jedediah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Is this true? After your letters, after your promises?" Jedediah Stone, the rancher who had written of building a future, could not meet her gaze. He stared at the dust, his jaw working silently. A muscle twitched in his cheek. "Father knows best, Miss Vane." He mumbled the words, costing him a visible effort. "This was a mistake." A mistake. 6 months of correspondence, 1,000 miles of travel, a lifetime of hope, all reduced to a single dismissive word. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just a rejection. It was a public spectacle, a deliberate act of destruction. Silas Stone had orchestrated this to be as painful as possible. "You will take the next stagecoach back to wherever it is you came from," Silas commanded, pulling a small, heavy purse from his coat. He tossed it onto the ground near her feet, where it landed with a dull, insulting thud. "This will cover your passage. The Stone family pays its expenses." Tears pricked at Zara's eyes, hot and furious, but she refused to let them fall. Her pride, the only thing she had left solidified into a core of steel within her. She drew herself up to her full height, her chin lifting. She looked at Silas Stone, then at his cowering son, and then at the silent watching faces of the town. "I may be without family or fortune, Mr. Stone," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the silence, "but I am not a piece of livestock to be purchased and then rejected at market. And I will not be paid off like a whore." She turned her back on the money, on the Stones, on the wreckage of her hopes, and walked head held high toward the only other building that looked remotely habitable, the saloon, which had a sign proclaiming boarding rooms hanging crookedly from its porch. With every step, she felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. She did not know what she would do. She had less than $2 to her name, no allies, and no way back. She had walked into a trap, and it had snapped shut. From the deep, cool shadows of the blacksmith's forge, a man watched the entire scene unfold. He was not a townsman. He was tall and lean, with the fluid grace of a predator. His black hair was long tied back with a simple leather thong. His face, weathered and angular, was a mask of stoicism, but his dark, intelligent eyes missed nothing. They saw the hope in the woman's face curdle into disbelief, the calculated cruelty of the father, the pathetic weakness of the son. Most of all, they saw the flicker of defiance, the spine of iron that refused to bend even as it was being broken. His name was Cale, and he was Apache. He worked as a tracker for the army and a horsebreaker for anyone who paid fairly. He rarely came into town and spoke even less. He had learned long ago that silence was a shield. But as he watched Zara Vane walk away, her dignity a tattered flag flying in the face of defeat, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of recognition, a sense of shared injustice. And for the first time in a very long time, the shield of his silence felt less like protection and more like a cage. The saloon, named the Dusty Spur, was a cacophony of noise that assaulted Zara the moment she pushed through the swinging doors. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and frying fat. A piano in the corner was being tortured by a man in a bowler hat. Rough-looking men at card tables stopped their games to stare as she entered, their gazes lingering. For a moment, her courage wavered. This was no place for a lady. But then, she wasn't a lady anymore. She was a survivor, a stout woman with fiery red hair piled high on her head, and a surprisingly kind face wiped down the long bar with a rag. "You lost honey." I saw the sign for boarding rooms," Zara said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need a room." The woman's eyes softened with a look that was part pity, part appraisal. "I'm Martha, and I saw what just happened out there. That was a low-down, snake-bellied thing for Silas Stone to do." She glanced at Zara's expensive, dust-covered dress. "You got money for a room." "I have a little," Zara admitted, not wanting to reveal just how little. Martha chewed on her lip, her gaze flicking to the men watching them. "A week, in advance, $5. Zara's heart sank. I don't have that much." "Look, honey," Martha said, her voice dropping. "This ain't Boston. A woman on her own here, especially a handsome one, she's got two choices. She either gets married or she gets a job in a place like this. And trust me," she added with a world-weary sigh, "you ain't cut out for this job." The reality of her situation settled on Zara like a physical weight. She was trapped. She could not go back, and she could not go forward. "I can work," Zara said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "I can cook. I can clean. I'm a quick learner. I can read and write. I can do your accounts." Martha looked tempted, but shook her head. "Silas Stone owns this town. He owns the bank that holds the note on this saloon. If I take you in, he'll find a way to make me pay. He'll call in my debt, cut off my liquor supply. He wants you gone, girl, and what Silas wants, he usually gets." Defeated Zara nodded. "I understand." She turned to leave, her mind a blank slate of despair. Where would she go? What would she do? Spend the night in the street. The thought was terrifying. As she reached the swinging doors, they were pushed open from the outside. The man who entered was the Apache from the blacksmith's forge, Kyle. The saloon fell silent once more, but this was a different kind of silence. It was not of shock, but of wary respect and a deep-seated fear. The men at the card tables looked down at their hands. The piano player's music faltered and died. Kyle's presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. He moved with a quiet confidence that belied his station. His moccasins made no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. His dark eyes, which seemed to see everything, found Zara. He stopped a few feet from her, his expression unreadable. He was taller than she had realized, and there was a coiled strength about him that was both intimidating and strangely reassuring. He did not speak. He simply looked at her. Then his gaze shifted to Martha behind the bar. He raised a single hand palm open, and then made a series of swift, graceful gestures. It was a language of the hands intricate and expressive. Martha watched, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked from Kyle's hands to Zara's face, her eyes widening in disbelief. What is he saying?" Zara asked, her voice trembling. Martha let out a slow, astonished breath. "Good Lord in heaven," she whispered. She looked at Kyle. "Are you serious?" Kyle met her gaze and gave a single slow nod. His eyes then returned to Zara, and they held a question. "Honey," Martha said, her voice full of awe. "This man, Kyle, he's Apache. He doesn't speak much English. Hasn't for years, they say, not since his family was killed in a raid. He just made you an offer." Zara stared, confused. "An offer? What kind of offer?" Martha leaned over the bar, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The only kind of offer that can save you right now. He knows who you are, what happened. He knows Silas Stone will try to crush you. He's offering you protection. He's offering you his name." The world tilted on its axis. Zara stared at the silent Apache man, at his stoic face, and the intense question in his eyes. A marriage proposal from a man she did not know, a man who did not speak, a man who was as much an outcast in this society as she had just become. It was insane. It was unthinkable. A proper Bostonian woman marrying an Apache tracker. The very idea was scandalous. But what was her alternative? Starvation, humiliation. The grim fate Martha had hinted at. She looked at Kyle again, truly looked at him. She saw past the stereotypes, past the fear in the eyes of the other men in the room. She saw a quiet dignity that dwarfed the brutish arrogance of Silas Stone and the weak compliance of his son. She saw the hands that had spoken a language for him, strong and capable hands. And in his eyes she saw not pity, but something that looked like respect. He wasn't offering to rescue a damsel. He was offering an alliance to a fellow survivor. He had seen her at her lowest moment, covered in the shame of public rejection, and he had not seen weakness. He had seen something worth protecting. The choice was madness, but in a world that had suddenly gone mad, it was the only choice that felt sane. It was a leap, not into a darker abyss, but off a cliff, hoping for wings. Her voice, when she found it, was steady. She did not speak to Martha. She spoke directly to Kael, meeting his unwavering gaze. "Yes," she said. "I accept." A collective gasp went through the saloon. Kael's stoic expression did not change, but for a fraction of a second, something flickered in the depths of his dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or relief. He gave another single sharp nod. The deal was sealed. He turned and walked out of the saloon as silently as he had entered. Zara was left standing in the sudden vacuum, the buzz of astonished whispers rising around her. Martha just shook her head, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across her face. "Well, I'll be," she breathed. "Silas Stone wanted to run you out of town. He just gave you the one man in this territory that even he won't dare to cross." The wedding was a stark, hurried affair. The circuit judge, a weary man named Peterson, who smelled of whiskey and regret, was routed from his afternoon stupor by Sheriff Brody. The ceremony took place in the sheriff's small, cramped office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and gun oil. Zara stood beside Kael, acutely aware of the chasm between them. She wore the same blue dress now brushed clean by Martha. Kael stood in his worn buckskins, his posture erect, his face an impassive mask. Martha was her witness, her presence a small, warm comfort in the sterile room. Sheriff Brody stood for Kael, his face etched with a mixture of concern and grudging admiration. Judge Peterson mumbled the words, stumbling over Kael's name. When it came time for vows, Zara's "I do" was a quiet breath. Kael simply nodded his affirmation as silent and binding as an oath sworn to the mountains. The judge pronounced them man and wife, signed the certificate with a shaky hand, and promptly poured himself a drink. Legally, Zara Vane was no more. She was now Zara, wife of Kael. The name felt foreign on her tongue, a garment that didn't fit. There were no celebrations, no well-wishes beyond a tight-lipped "good luck, ma'am" from the sheriff and a fierce hug from Martha. "Be patient with him," Martha whispered in her ear. "His silence runs deeper than his tongue." Then she was alone with her new husband. Kael led her to a sturdy-looking pony tethered outside. He had already purchased her valise from the stagecoach office. With an economy of motion, he secured it behind the saddle, then gestured for her to mount. He moved to his own horse, a powerful Appaloosa with intelligent eyes, and swung himself into the saddle with a fluid grace. Without a word, he nudged his horse forward, leading them out of Redemption Creek. Zara followed her mind, a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. The looks they received from the few people still on the street were a cocktail of shock scorn and raw disbelief. She had traded one form of public spectacle for another. They rode east away from the setting sun into a landscape that grew wilder and more beautiful with every mile. The dusty flats gave way to rolling hills dotted with pinyon pine and juniper. The silence between them was vast, broken only by the clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the cry of a distant hawk. Zara, a woman of words and books, found the quiet unnerving. She wanted to ask him where they were going, what his home was like, what he expected of her. But the questions died in her throat, useless against the wall of his silence. After nearly 2 hours, as dusk began to purple the sky, Kyle turned off the main trail onto a barely there path that wound its way up into a small secluded canyon. A creek, its water clear and shimmering over smooth stones, ran through the canyon floor. Tucked into a grove of cottonwood trees was a small cabin. It was not a hovel. It was built of sturdy, expertly notched logs with a stone chimney and a small, well-tended porch. It was small and isolated, but it was solid. It was a home. Kyle dismounted and, taking the reins of her pony, tethered both animals near the creek. He unstrapped her valise and carried it to the porch, setting it down gently. Then he stood back, his eyes watching her, giving her space to absorb her new surroundings. The cabin consisted of a single room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A bed neatly made with thick wool blankets occupied one corner. The other corner held shelves stocked with dried herbs, sacks of flour and beans, and a few pieces of simple pottery. It was spare, masculine, and impeccably clean. There was a place for everything, and everything was in its place. This was his world. And now it was hers. The first few days were a study in awkward, silent negotiation. Zara, accustomed to the structured life of a Boston household, tried to find her place. She unpacked her few belongings, her books, a silver-backed brush, a locket with miniatures of her parents. She placed them on a small shelf, small, fragile outposts of her old life in this new, rugged territory. She tried to cook. Her first attempt at campfire biscuits were charred on the outside and raw on the inside. Kyle ate 2 without a word, his expression unchanging. Mortified, Zara threw the rest away. The next day she watched him. She observed how he banked the coals, how he mixed the dough, the precise way he handled the cast-iron skillet. Her next batch was better. He would leave at dawn each day, disappearing into the wilderness as silently as the morning mist. He would return at dusk, sometimes with a rabbit or a brace of quail, which he would skin and clean with an almost surgical precision. He never told her where he went or what he did. She learned about his life not through words, but through the evidence of his actions. She saw the skill in his tracking from the way he read the earth, the patience in his hands as he mended a leather strap, the deep-seated respect for nature in the way he wasted nothing. Her world shrank to the cabin and the small clearing around it. His world was the vast surrounding wilderness. At night, they shared the small cabin, a universe of silence between them. He would sit at the table carving small, intricate figures of animals from pieces of wood, a hawk, a wolf, a deer. She would sit by the fire reading her books aloud. At first, she did it for her own comfort to fill the oppressive silence. But she soon realized he was listening. He would stop his carving, his hands still, his dark eyes fixed on the fire, and she knew the words were reaching him, crossing the void. One evening, reading from The Tempest, she came to Miranda's line, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in't." Her voice caught. She looked up and met his gaze across the flickering firelight. In that moment, the cabin did not feel like a prison, and he did not feel like a stranger. He was her husband. This was her home. It was a strange and terrifying new world, but she was not alone in it. The silence was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the language of shared tasks, of quiet observation, of mutual respect. It was a foundation being laid one silent day at a time for something neither of them could yet name. News of the marriage spread through Redemption Creek and the surrounding ranches like a prairie fire. It was a scandal, a perversion of the natural order in the eyes of most. A Boston lady meant for the heir of the Stone Empire married to an Apache. It was an act of defiance that Silas Stone could not and would not tolerate. It began subtly. When Zara rode into town for supplies a few weeks after the wedding, she found herself an object of open hostility. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor of the general store, who had been polite enough on her arrival, suddenly couldn't meet her eye. "Can't sell you this flour?" she said, her voice tight. "Got a bad weevil infestation in my stock. All of it." It was a blatant lie. Zara had seen another rancher's wife buy a 50-pound sack not 10 minutes earlier. She went to the butcher who claimed all his meat was spoken for. The story was the same everywhere. A wall of polite but firm refusal. Silas Stone's influence was a poison that had seeped into the very soul of the town. He was choking them out. She returned to the cabin with only a small bag of salt she'd managed to purchase from a traveling tinker. She felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but this time it was mixed with a cold fury. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was an attack on her husband on their home. When Kyle returned that evening, he took one look at the meager supplies and her stormy face. He didn't need words to understand. He simply knotted his jaw tight. The next morning, he left with his bow instead of his rifle. He returned that evening with a young doe slung over his horse. For the next 2 days, they worked together, Zara following his silent instructions to smoke and dry the meat, ensuring they would not go hungry. He was showing her, not telling her, that they did not need the town. They could provide for themselves. But Silas Stone was not a man to be so easily thwarted. If he couldn't starve them out, he would terrorize them. One afternoon, while Kyle was away, Zara was tending to the small garden she had started near the creek. It was her own small act of defiance, a patch of order and life in the wilderness. She had painstakingly cultivated rows of beans, squash, and corn from seeds Martha had slipped her. As she worked, a low rumble started growing steadily into a thunderous roar. She looked up to see a terrifying sight. A wave of cattle, at least 100 head, was stampeding directly down the canyon, their eyes wide with panic, their horns a forest of sharpened points. They were being driven hard by 2 riders' men she recognized as foremen from the Stone Ranch, the Double S. Panic seized her. She was directly in their path. She scrambled back toward the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. The herd thundered past their hooves, churning the earth, and plowed directly through her meticulously tended garden, obliterating it in a matter of seconds. It was a wanton act of destruction designed to inflict the maximum amount of emotional pain. When Kyle returned, he surveyed the wreckage. The trampled earth, the shredded plants, the deep hoofprints leading back toward the Stone Ranch. For the first time, Zara saw a flicker of raw, cold fury in his eyes. It was the look of a man pushed too far. He checked on her first, a brief searching glance to ensure she was unharmed. Then he walked to the edge of the ruined garden and knelt, picking up a single crushed tomato. He held it in his palm for a long moment before his fingers closed around it, squeezing the pulp out between his fingers. It was a silent vow of retribution. Meanwhile, a different kind of drama was playing out at the Stone Ranch. Jedediah Stone was consumed by a toxic cocktail of guilt and resentment. He had seen Zara in town, had seen the way people shunned her. He had heard the crude jokes about her marriage to the Indian. Each story was a fresh twist of the knife in his conscience. He had been a coward, and his cowardice had chained this decent woman to a life of hardship. His father Silas reveled in the situation. He saw it as a victory, a reinforcement of his power. "I hear your mail-order bride is learning to dig for roots with her Apache savage," Silas taunted Jed over dinner one night. "Perhaps we should have sent her a shovel as a wedding gift." "That's enough, father," Jed snapped his voice tight. "Enough." Silas slammed his fist on the table, making the fine china jump. "It will be enough when that redskin and his white squaw are gone from my valley. They are a stain on this land, an insult to our name." Jed pushed back from the table, his face pale. "She did nothing to you. You set out to destroy her for no reason other than your own pride." "Pride is all a man has," Silas roared. "Something you know nothing about. You would have married that penniless piece of baggage and diluted the Stone bloodline. I saved you from yourself." That night, Jedediah did something he hadn't done in years. He defied his father, albeit secretly. Under the cover of darkness, he rode out a sack of flour and a parcel of salted bacon tied to his saddle. He felt a desperate need to make some small amends to ease the gnawing guilt. He left the supplies at the edge of the canyon trail leading to Kyl's cabin, a silent offering of apology. He didn't have the courage to face them, but it was a start. When Kyle found the sack the next morning, he examined it carefully. He saw the tracks of a single rider, the brand on the sack from the Stone Ranch's own stores. He looked toward the distant Stone lands, his expression thoughtful. He did not bring the supplies into the cabin. He left them where they were untouched. He would not accept charity born of guilt from the son of the man who was trying to destroy him. This was a war, and in war you do not accept gifts from the enemy. The lines were drawn. Silas Stone had escalated his campaign from social ostracism to direct aggression. He did not know that he wasn't just attacking a lone woman and a silent Apache. He was attacking their home, and he had grievously underestimated the resilience of both of them. More importantly, he had no idea of the true value of the land he was trying to seize. He thought he was fighting over pride. The real fight was over something far more precious: water. The summer deepened, and the heat became a physical presence, baking the land until it cracked. The grasses in the vast rangelands of the Double S turned from green to gold, then to a brittle, dusty brown. Creeks that normally ran full began to shrink, dwindling to muddy trickles before disappearing entirely. It was the beginning of a drought, the kind that could ruin a cattle baron. Silas Stone felt the pressure mounting. His herds were vast, and their thirst was insatiable. His ranch had several wells and access to the Red River, but with thousands of head of cattle, even those sources were being taxed. His foreman reported cattle growing thin, their ribs starting to show. He needed more water, and he needed it now. This was the true unspoken reason for his obsession with the small canyon occupied by Kyle. It wasn't just about the insult of the marriage. The canyon Kyle had settled years ago was considered worthless by most, too small for grazing, too rocky for farming. But Kyle, with his deep understanding of the land, knew its secret. The creek that ran through it, the one that fed Zara's now destroyed garden, was fed by a deep, year-round artesian spring, hidden high up in the rocks. It was a geological anomaly, a vein of pure, cold water that never failed, not even in the driest of summers. Silas had discovered this a year prior when one of his survey maps revealed the spring's existence. That water, piped down to his rangelands, would be the lifeblood of his empire. It would drought-proof his ranch and give him an unshakable hold over every smaller rancher in the territory. He had tried to buy Kyle out, offering a pittance for the land. Kyle, who had no interest in money and a deep ancestral connection to that specific place, had refused. Silas then tried intimidation, but Kyle was not a man easily intimidated. He was waiting for an opportunity to legally seize the land or force Kyle off. Zara's arrival and subsequent rejection had been a nuisance, but her marriage to Kyle, that was a disaster. An unlanded Apache was one thing, but an Apache married to a white woman with a legal marriage certificate signed by a territorial judge had a much stronger claim to the land under the white man's law. Kyle now had a legal wife and a homestead. Silas's path to the water was suddenly blocked by a piece of paper in Sheriff Brody's office. His frustration boiled over into rage. He summoned his two most ruthless hands, a pair of hard cases named Corbin and Lee. They were men who did the kind of work that Silas didn't want his regular ranch hands involved in. "That Indian's got to go," Silas told them, his voice low and dangerous as they stood in his opulent study, and his white wife with him. "Just run him off, boss," Corbin asked, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was a big slovenly man with a missing front tooth. "I want it to be permanent," Silas said, his meaning clear. "But I want it to look legal. I want him caught red-handed, rustling, stealing from me. An Indian rustler shot while resisting arrest. Nobody will question that. Brody will have to accept the evidence." He laid out his plan. Corbin and Lee were to cut a half-dozen double S steers from a herd grazing near the canyon. They would drive them onto Kael's land, then go get Sheriff Brody claiming they'd caught the Apache in the act. The confrontation would be violent. In the ensuing struggle, Kael would be killed. As for the woman, Silas waved a dismissive hand. "She'll run once he's gone. She's a city girl. She won't last a week on her own." He underestimated Zara. The woman who had arrived 2 months ago was not the same woman living in the canyon. The Boston lady had been shed like a snake's skin, and in her place was someone harder, more observant, more resilient. Living with Kael had been an education. She had learned to read the land, to understand the subtle shifts in the wind, the meaning of a bird's sudden cry. She learned to be silent herself, to watch, and to listen. The silence that had once been a void was now a shared language. A raised eyebrow from Kael was a question. A tilt of his head was a warning. She learned to understand the tension in his shoulders, the focus in his eyes. Their relationship had deepened into something that defied easy definition. It was a partnership forged in adversity. One evening, as he was carving, he looked at her hands, which were now calloused and scratched from her work around the cabin. He wordlessly took one of her hands in his touch surprisingly gentle. He ran his thumb over the calluses, his expression unreadable, but for a softness in his eyes she had never seen before. It was an acknowledgment of her labor, of her transformation. It was more intimate than any flowery words Jedediah had ever written. She had also discovered his own hidden vulnerability. Sometimes in the dead of night, she would hear him whisper names in his sleep, in the flowing, guttural sounds of the Apache tongue. They were names spoken with love and profound sorrow. She knew without ever being told that he was dreaming of the family he had lost. It made her fiercely protective of this silent, wounded man. The day Corbin and Lee set Silas's plan in motion, Zara was alone. Kael had gone south, tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on fawns near the spring. She was mending one of his shirts on the porch when she heard a faint, distant lowing of cattle. It was unusual. The double S herds grazed miles from their canyon. Her newfound instincts, honed by Kael's quiet tutelage, kicked in. Something was wrong. She put down her sewing and moved to the edge of the clearing, using the trees as cover. She saw them, then 6 steers with the clear double S brand, being driven into the lower part of their canyon by Corbin and Lee. They were clumsy about it, leaving a clear, wide trail. Too clear. It was a setup. Panic warred with a cold, clear-headed anger. They were trying to frame Kael. The sheriff would be brought in, and there would be a misunderstanding. A fatal one. Kael was miles away, and wouldn't be back until evening. She was alone. The Boston lady would have wept or run for help. The woman of Redemption Creek did neither. She thought of Kael's quiet strength, of his unwavering defense of their home. She thought of his silent acknowledgement of her own resilience. He had offered her his name for protection. Now she would protect his. Her eyes scanned the cabin. Her gaze fell upon the shotgun Kael kept loaded with rock salt for scaring away predators. Then her eyes fell upon her treasured books. An idea desperate and dangerous began to form in her mind. It was a plan born of intellect and fire, a plan Silas Stone, in his arrogant dismissal of her, could never have anticipated. She was not just a woman who could survive in the West. She was a woman who could fight back with weapons of her own making. Zara's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her hands were steady. There was no time for fear. There was only time for action. She dragged the heavy sacks of flour and dried beans to the doorway of the cabin. She remembered Kael showing her how certain dried plants ground into a fine powder could create a thick, acrid smoke when burned. She found his pouch of herbs and added a generous amount to the mix. Next, she grabbed the small keg of black powder Kael used for his rifle cartridges. Working quickly, she laid a thin, barely visible trail of powder from the doorway out towards the dense thicket of juniper bushes 20 yards away. Finally, she took Kael's shotgun. It felt heavy and alien in her hands. He had shown her how to use it once, a simple lesson in loading and firing at a distant stump. Her target now would be much closer. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and determination, and positioned herself just inside the cabin, concealed by the shadows. An hour passed, an eternity of waiting. Then she heard them, the sound of horses, and the self-important voice of Corbin. "Right down here, Sheriff. Drove him right into his canyon plain as day. Caught him red-handed." "We'll see," came the weary, skeptical voice of Sheriff Brody. "Kael ain't a fool, and he ain't a thief." "He's an Indian, ain't he?" Lee sneered. "Thievin' is in their blood." They came into view, Corbin and Lee in the lead, looking smug, with Sheriff Brody following his face grim. They rode toward the part of the canyon where the stolen steers were now milling about nervously. "There they are," Corbin shouted, pointing with theatrical flair. "Double S brand, every one of 'em. Now let's go get our rustler." They turned their horses toward the cabin. This was it. Zara's grip tightened on the shotgun. Her plan was a gamble, a desperate piece of theater. It had to work. As the three men approached the clearing, Zara struck a match. She touched it to the trail of black powder. A fizzing serpentine line of fire shot across the ground, racing toward the juniper bushes. It reached the small pile of powder and herbs she had placed there, which erupted with a loud whoosh into a cloud of thick, choking smoke. The horses screamed and reared in terror. Sheriff Brody, a seasoned horseman, managed to control his mount. But Corbin and Lee were taken completely by surprise. Lee was thrown hard, landing with a grunt in the dust. Corbin's horse bolted, bucking and spinning wildly. "What in tarnation?" Brody yelled, his eyes stinging from the smoke. At that exact moment, Zara stepped out of the cabin. She didn't aim the shotgun at the men. She aimed it at the sacks of flour and beans piled in the doorway behind her. She pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the small canyon. The rock salt shredded the sacks, which exploded in a massive white cloud, a blizzard of flour and beans that billowed out from the cabin. It looked for all the world as if the cabin itself had been the source of a massive explosion. Through the swirling dust and smoke, Zara screamed a calculated, piercing cry of terror. "Help fire, he's gone mad!" Sheriff Brody, peering through the haze, saw a scene of utter chaos. Smoke and explosion from the cabin, and the new bride screaming her head off. Corbin was still fighting his horse, and Lee was groaning on the ground. This wasn't the clean, simple arrest of a rustler. This was a war zone. "Corbin Lee, what did you do?" Brody roared, his suspicion now fully ignited. Before they could answer, a new player entered the stage. Kael appeared at the top of the canyon ridge. He had heard the shotgun blast from a mile away and had run the entire distance. He moved like a phantom, silent and lethal. He saw the scene below his home shrouded in dust, his wife standing with a shotgun, the sheriff, and the two Double S thugs. He didn't make a sound. He simply knocked an arrow to his bow. The message was unmistakable. Corbin finally wrestled his horse under control. He saw Kael on the ridge, an arrow aimed squarely at his chest. He saw the sheriff, his hand now on his pistol, his face a mask of fury. And he saw Zara no longer screaming but standing tall, the shotgun held at the ready. The trap had been turned on the trappers. "It's a setup, Sheriff!" Zara called out, her voice clear and strong. "They drove the cattle in here and were going to kill him. They were going to kill us both." "She's lying!" Lee sputtered, getting to his feet and pulling his pistol. "The squaw is lying." He never got to aim. An arrow whistled through the air and embedded itself in the wooden porch post a mere inch from Lee's head. The force of it made the wood shudder. Lee froze his eyes wide with terror, a dark stain spreading on the front of his trousers. The standoff was absolute. Tense seconds ticked by. Then another rider came galloping into the canyon. It was Jedediah Stone. He had heard the plan from a stable hand, and his guilt had finally boiled over into action. He couldn't let it happen. He skidded his horse to a halt, his face pale and anguished. "Father sent them," he yelled, his voice cracking. "He sent them to kill Cale. It was all a lie." That was all Sheriff Brody needed. The confession of the son sealed the fate of the father. "Corbin, Lee, drop your guns." Brody commanded his own pistol, now drawn and steady. "You're under arrest for attempted murder." Corbin hesitated for a second, then his eyes met Cale's on the ridge. He saw no mercy there. He let his gun belt fall to the dust. Lee, still trembling, did the same. Cale lowered his bow. He walked down the ridge, his eyes never leaving Zara. He stopped in front of her, his gaze taking in the shotgun, the exploded sacks, her defiant stance. He looked at the chaos she had single-handedly created. He reached out and took the heavy shotgun from her hands. His eyes searched her face, and for the first time his mask of stoicism cracked. A slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a look of profound, unadulterated pride. Then he turned his head and looked at Jedediah Stone. He gave a single sharp nod. It was not forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgment, an acceptance of an act of courage. Jedediah met his gaze, then looked at Zara, at the strong, capable woman she had become. He saw what he had thrown away, not for love or honor, but for fear. The shame of it settled on him heavy and permanent. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, not back to the Double S Ranch, but west, away from his father, away from Redemption Creek, to find whatever was left of his own soul. The arrest of Corbin and Lee, coupled with Jedediah's public confession, shattered the foundation of Silas Stone's power. Sheriff Brody, armed with an undeniable case, rode to the Double S Ranch and arrested the cattle baron himself. The trial was the talk of the territory. Silas, arrogant to the last, was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. His empire, built on fear and intimidation, began to crumble as smaller ranchers, no longer afraid, testified against his decades of ruthless expansion. The canyon was quiet again. The trampled garden was slowly being reclaimed, new shoots pushing their way through the disturbed earth. The cabin, cleaned of the flour and dust, felt more like a sanctuary than ever before. The threat had passed, not because they had run or hidden, but because they had stood their ground together. The dynamic between Zara and Cale had fundamentally shifted. The silence was no longer a barrier. It was a deep, comfortable understanding. They were partners in every sense of the word. They worked side by side, rebuilding the garden, reinforcing the small corral. He taught her how to read the stars, and she read to him from her book of Shakespearean sonnets by the firelight. One crisp autumn evening, a month after the trial, they sat on the porch watching the sun set, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and deep purple. Zara had been quiet for a long time, watching him as he carefully repaired the handle of a tool. "You never told me," she said softly, "why you did it." Cale stopped his work, though he didn't look at her. He knew what she meant, why he had stepped out of the shadows in the saloon that day. "Why offer me your name? You didn't know me. You owed me nothing." He set the tool down and turned to face her. The evening light softened the harsh lines of his face, making him look younger. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced down armed men with a shotgun and a sack of flour, the woman who read poetry to him by the fire, the woman who had filled the desolate silence of his life with a quiet strength that matched his own. For years his voice had been a tomb for his grief, the English language a bitter reminder of the world that had taken everything from him. He had vowed to keep it buried, but sitting here with her the vow felt like a chain, not a shield. He reached out his calloused fingers, gently touching her cheek. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time since she had met him, he spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, low and gravelly, but it was clear. "I saw you," he said the two words, holding the weight of 1,000 silent observations. "I saw strength." He hesitated as if searching for a word he had long since discarded. Zara. It was the first time he had ever said her name. The sound of it in his voice was a revelation. It was not the name of a Boston orphan or a jilted mail-order bride. It was her name, spoken by her husband. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock of a wall crumbling to dust. Tears welled in Zara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of profound, overwhelming joy. She leaned into his touch, her hand covering his. The future was still an unwritten page. They were still two people from different worlds, a silent Apache tracker and a scholar from Boston, but they had forged a new world together in the heart of that small canyon, a world built not on promises whispered through the mail, but on shared hardship, mutual respect, and a love that had found its voice in the deepest of silences. The West was a harsh and unforgiving land, but for the first time for both of them, it was truly home. The story of Zara and Kael is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. It's a reminder that true strength isn't found in wealth or power, like that of Silas Stone, but in courage, dignity, and the willingness to stand for what is right, even when you stand alone. Theirs was a love story that didn't start with a kiss, but with a silent offer of protection, a bond forged not in words, but in shared struggle and unwavering respect. They found in each other a sanctuary from a world that had tried to break them both. If their journey from humiliation to triumph moved you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with a friend who appreciates a powerful story of love and justice against all odds. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales from the untamed heart of the American West. Click that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for listening.